Good afternoon, everyone. It's CM Kosemen again, and I know it's been a while, but hey, life gets in the way. And to reward your patience, I'm now back with an exciting video about Aistopods and Lysorophins, two main lineages of legless, superficially snake-like amphibians. And this is gonna be a Paleo-Profile video. And just to get this out of the way, I know and I must recommend that the guy to go to for Paleo-Profile videos is Trey the Explainer. He's my very good YouTube friend that I never met, but I hope in the upcoming years this can change. And he does really great Paleo-Profile videos for all sorts of dinosaurs, extinct relatives of dinosaurs, crocodilians, strange prehistoric creatures, and he's been very successful at it. And you should go check out his channel. You probably know of his channel if you come to my channel, because he's got a really big subscriber base and he's got a really nice community of friends and followers around him. So a hat tip to Trey the Explainer. I'm borrowing his format here, and this is gonna be a Paleo-Profile video about two main lineages of snake-like amphibians. But before we begin, I'd like you to perhaps, if you can, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and if possible, donate me through Patreon on the link below. And even if you give like $1 where I live, it can buy me like a really good lunch or like a really good dinner. So, none of your money goes to waste, and anything you give towards my way, supports this whole creative scientific enterprise going. So yeah, please consider donating to this poor fella. And without much ado, here we go. So now, when people think about amphibians, they immediately think of frogs, and if they're a bit more literate, zoology literate, they think about salamanders. And a few nerds in the community will probably remember Caecilians. These are legless amphibians that are still alive today, and you usually see their names in these like shock or weirdo type of articles. They say this crazy blind snake looks like an alien and it feeds its babies on its skin or something like that. These are all correct, but the way they write about these is, I find it like low-hanging fruit. There's much more to write about Caecilians. They're very interesting creatures, obviously. In the video description, you can read more about Caecilians. I'll just go over them briefly in this video because we have to get to the real deal. So before we get there, Caecilians, they live in South America, India, and certain other parts of the world. Most of them look like really thick worms, and their eyes are obscured. A few species do have visible-ish sorts of eyes. If you look at them in an X-ray, though, they get really weird because they are like all body. To my best knowledge, they have either very short tails or almost no tails. So snakes, on the other hand, for example, if you look at snakes, half of the snake's body length might be its tail. But if you X-ray a Caecilian, it's just one animal, mouth to butt, and that's it. It's just one stocky, heavily built, burrowing, worm-like thing, and it's an amphibian. They reproduce like salamanders and frogs do, and some species do give live birth, and among them there are a few that have this thickening of their skin in the belly region, so the juveniles can nibble on it, and there we get the scandalous, tantalizing, or cannibal mother headline thing. But anyways, those are Caecilians, and they're really interesting creatures. I've never seen one in the wild, and if you have seen a Caecilian in the wild, please comment. I'm really curious, what was it like? And that's one more thing on my bucket list. But if you go deeper back into history, the history of the things which we call amphibians is far deeper and far more complicated. Now, in the Carboniferous, Permian, and to a degree Devonian periods, the world used to be ruled by things that many people equate to amphibians today. And it was once believed that these were just gigantic versions of the frogs and salamanders running around today. But actually, no. The ancient amphibians were extremely diverse and extremely complicated. And the frogs and salamanders and Caecilians we have running around today are actually like a really modern offshoot of an offshoot of an offshoot of this extremely diverse lineage. And within themselves, prehistoric amphibians had things called temnospondyls and leptospondyls and labyrinthodonts, which are now thought to be an artificial grouping, but and also things called like parareptiles. And I'm not really good with this classification, so I don't want to make any mistakes, but I mean, they were not all like frogs at all. I mean, many of them had a scaly body covering, much like reptiles, but also a bit like fish, you know. So they didn't have the smooth, froggy skin. A lot of fossil book reconstructions make this error, actually. You look at these gigantic, croc-like prehistoric amphibians, and they're all like smooth skinned, like a newt or a toad, you know. But that wasn't the case. Most of them actually had like really hard nodular skin, and they were a bit more like bony fish in that respect. So that's one interesting thing about these groups. And in themselves, members of these groups were very diverse. And you probably know of this really bizarre boomerang-headed thing called Diplocolus. So that's one. And then there was another thing that looked like it was like run over by a truck or something, and they called it Gerothorax. It had big sky-facing eyes and a really flat body. Heaven knows what it did. Probably lived like a amphibian-esque flatfish. No one knows. Then there were like really weird things. I remember in my children's books there was always this picture of this thing called Greerpeton, which is Greerpeton, which was like this enormous, like elongated crocodile kind of thing with very small limbs, and I always thought that was a really cool one. Then there was this other thing called Crassigyrinus. I'm not even going to bother spelling that, but basically it looked like a 1 meter or 2 meter long tadpole with like very sharp teeth and tiny legs. And you know, if that's the tadpole, what's the frog look like? Well, I don't know what the frog looked like. No one knows, but it's a really like bizarre and bamboozling and scary paleontological enigma. And then on the other hand of the amphibianesque spectrum, you had things like that were virtually indistinguishable from reptiles. You know, they probably laid eggs, but due to taxonomic, evolutionary, and classification-based reasons, you still wouldn't call these guys reptiles. They call them parareptiles or amniota, or I don't know. I don't want to make mistakes, so I'm skipping on the exact name they give these guys to. But they were like the versions of amphibians that were really close to the ancestry of present-day reptiles. And just to repeat an important fact again, the present-day frogs and newts and whatever come from an extremely derived lineage of amphibians that has almost very few things to do. Like, imagine the amphibians running around today are like hamsters, okay? And then the ancient amphibians would be things like marsupials. They're like entirely different lineages of evolution in that kind of grouping, but they're still very distinct. So anyways, I think I've said enough about this point. So within that enormous variety, we're going to profile two snake-like and little-known members. Like, if you mention these on a date or in a gathering of friends or at the family dinner table, I'm sure everyone's gonna love you and, you know, shower you with adoration, love, and respect, and they will have no questions about your well-being whatsoever. So we have the snake-like ancient extinct amphibians, and their names are really cool. So we begin with Aistopoda. This is really cool because usually in most spellings of this group, the dot or the umlaut on top of the I has two dots. It's a bizarre phonetic letter, and usually this letter is used. So I don't know how it's spelled. I would call it Aistopoda, just because if it had one dot, I would call it Aistopods, but the two dots always make it like, in my head, it feels so arcane and, a bit more Oxford or Cambridge Dawn type, kind of Aistopod or something like that. Anyways, these were like the really snake-like of the snake-like amphibians. By being snake-like, I mean they really seem to have lived and occupied a similar ecological niche to the snakes that we have today. They lived in between the Carboniferous and early Permian periods. So back when the world was covered with forests so thick and so swampy that they made up our coal and petroleum reserves later on. And surprisingly little is known about this environment. It looks like it was just forests, the globe encompassing forests without end, and all sorts of weird like things that look like crocodiles or fish or amphibians or neither ran and flopped around in it. Some of them had eardrums, so maybe in the night these forests would be like, but you would never get to see what's making that sound, because it's likely that the trees were in most areas so tightly packed that a person would have a very difficult time venturing in between them. And then imagine an entire continent covered with this kind of landscape, and it's just mind-blowing. And in this bizarre and Lovecraftian environment evolved the Aistopods. Now, imagine they're like kind of fishy salamander with no legs, and maybe you'll start getting at it, but we know that they had actually like a distinct kind of scale-like body covering that actually resembled the skin covering of like prehistoric lobe-finned fish. So they were really strange, and from what I've been able to gather, some of their features were actually extremely primitive. So their skulls resembled those of fish more than other amphibians did. But we don't know if this was like a genuine atavism, or if this was a result of convergent evolution, because these guys lived like snakes. They probably fed on animals bigger than their heads, let's say, and they swallowed them whole. In fact, some of the later species, such as Phlegetonia, that's Phlegetonia, like their jaw structures were very simplified. The entire jaw apparatus was reduced to a few toothpick-like fragments of bone, and it probably meant that these guys had really flexible mouths. They could like swallow really big food items, that sort of things. So it's impossible to understand if it was like already fish-like and thus simplified, or they had evolved through a more like robust jaw face and then simplified it again. Once again, no one knows. And I also read this bizarre anatomical note saying that they had an opening straight from the pituitary region of their brain into their mouth, which is supposedly a very, very primitive feature that only fish have. So maybe they were like an entirely... Like when you look at things in cladistic terms, these discussions become really interesting. I hope they're not boring you, but maybe these like early snake amphibians, the Aistopods, they were like straight up another evolution from fish-like tetrapods, let's say. Or maybe they were like the simplified versions of other prehistoric amphibians known as leptospondyls, and Like some scientists say that their closest relatives were the flatfish like Diplocolus and Gerothorax, and something happened and maybe that lineage gave rise to a simplified snake-like family. No one knows. Or maybe they were just a completely different line of fish that became like amphibians and lost their legs, and it's very crazy. And I don't know, I mean, the current view is that they were part of the leptospondyle amphibian group, but even things like what leptospondyls are is kind of open for discussion. So yeah, they were really strange for being what they were at that time of world's evolutionary history, more than what they looked like. Because okay, a snake, you can have it. Once you got a reptile, it's easy to have a snake. You just reduce a few legs and lengthen the tail, and hey presto. And in fact, many lizards living today have perfectly snake-like body plans. They've reduced their legs multiple times. But these guys, they were around in a very early period of vertebrate evolution. Now that kind of makes you wonder whether they were, like, once again, amphibian snakes or fish-like meta-amphibian or quasi-amphibian snakes. I don't know. But there you go. You have the Aistopods. Now, let's go back to that imaginary scenario where I thought I instructed you all to talk about Aistopods in a family dinner table or a date or whatever. Now, in 1 out of 100 families or 1 out of 100 dates, your family or date would actually know of Aistopods. But now there's the second group, which is like so obscure that like even in a table of nerds and geeks, and I'm not saying this derogatorily, I'm a nerd and geek too, even in a table of nerds and geeks, if you drop this bomb, you're like, ugh, the most obscure. Because you will be mentioning the Lysorophids, or another name for these is Molgophids. And they were like, once again, another relative of this great big leptospondyle group of amphibians. But the exact group they were related to were probably these things called microsaurs. Now, microsaurs were characterized by being kind of small, almost frog-like, with reduced tails and smallish limbs. But some species in this group were like a quasi-amphibian equivalent of a woodchuck. They had very big heads, short, stocky body, and smallish limbs, and their heads were really fused with bones, and they had really solidly built skull bones, and they were probably burrowers. So you had things like that, the reptilian or quasi-amphibian woodchuck, and then you had things like basically that resembled newts with big heads or whatever. And then on the extreme end of this microsaur radiation of the leptospondyle group of quasi-amphibians, you had the Lysorophids, another group of amphibian quasi-snakes. And in contrast to the Aistopods, who had the skull reduced to a like flexible sketch, these guys actually had really solid, like thick built skulls, and they had quite sharp teeth, but they were used for, I don't know, small burrowing prey items, I guess. And one species we know it's called Brachydectes, which is Brachydectes, Brachydectes. So it was a 43 centimeter long, not enormous, but if you look at burrowing animals, it's actually quite big. A 43 centimeter long snake-like thing with a very thick jaw, very heavily built skull. And just to make things more interesting, it may have retained tiny legs at either end, and it had a very short, almost non-existent tail. So it's another bizarre way to make a snake. Instead of a long tail, basically, you have just one long butt that crawls underground or probably swims for all eternity in this kind of Lovecraftian jungles of the Carboniferous and Permian periods. And I don't know, not much else can be said about Lysorophids, but if you look at similar animals today, you know there are these burrowing reptiles called amphibians, and they were thought to be like a unique group of burrowing reptiles, but then genetic studies placed them very close to lizards, so they are just very specialized burrowing lizards. And their jaws also have this like wicked, strong, very solidly built construction. And if you look at actually x-rays of these amphibians, and actually if you look at the skulls of the Lysorophids themselves, they look like these like completely monsters because their jaws are very thick, their teeth are very sharp and pointy. But of course you don't get to see any of that by looking at the animal. You know, if you just saw them in the mud, it would look like this like gummy, wormy kind of thing. But if you look at the skulls, they're very heavily built, and that's for a reason, because these animals are burrowers. They use the muscles of their entire body to dig through whatever they were digging through. And then when they catch a worm or other burrowing creature or whatever, they just like gnash on them, you know, chop, 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 that kind of stuff. And actually, maybe you could, there might be a parallel between having a like long body and no tail and a burrowing lifestyle, because as you could probably tell, in the backboned animals, the muscles that move the body are stronger than those that move the tail. So if these guys are moving underground, they're like pushing and pulling with their entire body, and that would, in an evolutionary time scale, that would cause the tail to shrink and disappear. So yeah, here we go, guys. Aistopods and Lysorophids, two extremely little known groups of extinct snake-like amphibians or meta-amphibians or whatever those things were. Please do study these things in further detail. I find them very interesting. Just even to remind myself that, you know, there's something about vertebrate evolution that rhymes. You know, millions of years before any snakes existed, these guys were running around and they were acting kind of like snakes or Caecilians or amphibians or whatever. And then millions of later, another entirely different group of reptiles evolved the same body plans. So I think it's I think it's a very interesting thing to study and think about, and it's just cool, you know. And I hope you share my ideas about it too, and I guess you share it because this is YouTube, you know. If you don't like something, you just don't watch it. But anyways, that was that, guys. Have a nice day, and please, once again, if you can, just support me on Patreon. Even $1, like if you can donate 50 cents, even that's a great thing, you know. Just consider supporting me so I can have more free time to talk about Aistopods and Lysorophids and Caecilians and whatever. And since we're doing this Paleo-Profile thing, now it's part of the CM Kosemen YouTube channel menu, you know. So consider leaving a suggestion on what I should do the next Paleo-Profile on. I cannot guarantee that I will do it, but hey, at least maybe you'll give me an idea. And once again, please like, share, and subscribe. And I love you all. Have a nice day. Goodbye.